The American Civil War had finally ground to a halt, leaving a nation battered but unified. Millions of Union soldiers, weary from years of fighting, yearned for home. The fastest way to get them back to their families was by river, and the Mississippi became a bustling highway for steamboats. Among these vessels, the Sultana stood out. It was a grand paddle-wheeler, built in 1863, and was considered quite modern for its time. With its twin smokestacks and ornate trim, it looked like a floating palace, ready to carry its precious cargo of returning heroes. Its reputation was solid, a symbol of progress and prosperity on the great river. Everyone looked to the Sultana as a reliable transport, a promise of safe passage home for the Union troops. However, beneath its elegant exterior, the Sultana harbored a critical flaw. Its 4 boilers, while advanced for the era, were designed to be compact and efficient, generating immense pressure to power the massive paddle wheels. This new technology was still in its early stages, and the risks associated with such high-pressure steam vessels were often underestimated. The rush to build and deploy these steamboats during and immediately after the war meant that safety considerations sometimes took a back seat to speed and capacity. There was a desperate need for transportation, and any available vessel was quickly pressed into service, sometimes without the rigorous checks that might have prevented future disasters. The very system meant to bring soldiers home quickly also created a dangerous incentive. The government paid steamboat captains per soldier transported. This financial lure was a powerful force, pushing captains to load as many men as possible onto their vessels. Frederick Speed, the captain of the Sultana, was no exception. He saw an opportunity to make a substantial profit, and he actively sought out military officials to secure contracts for transporting returning Union soldiers. The more soldiers he could pack onto his boat, the more money he would earn. This simple economic reality would set the stage for one of the worst maritime tragedies in American history, as profit began to outweigh caution. The Sultana arrived in Memphis, a vital hub for troop movements on the Mississippi. The docks were swarming with thousands of Union soldiers, all desperate to leave the war behind and return to their lives. Many had been prisoners of war in Confederate camps like Andersonville and Cahaba, and their bodies were frail, their spirits worn. They didn't care about comfort, they just wanted to go home. The Sultana, a seemingly magnificent vessel, was quickly identified as a primary transport. As the steamboat pulled alongside the crowded wharf, anticipation mixed with a palpable sense of urgency. The process of loading the soldiers began, and it quickly became clear that the Sultana was taking on far more than its intended capacity. The official limit for passengers was around 376, but military officials, eager to clear the camps and get the men moving, turned a blind eye. Soldiers were packed onto every available surface. The decks were jammed, cabins designed for a few held dozens, and even the cargo holds were filled with men. They lay shoulder to shoulder, standing room only. A sea of blue uniforms stretching as far as the eye could see. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the quiet hum of thousands of tired men. The sheer number of people was overwhelming, creating a living, breathing mass that strained the very structure of the boat. Amidst the chaos of loading, some crew members and even a few soldiers voiced concerns about the overcrowding. There were whispers about the strain on the boat, the lack of space and the potential dangers. However, Captain Speed, focused on his lucrative contract, dismissed these warnings. He was under immense pressure from military officials to transport the soldiers quickly. The journey upriver to Cairo, Illinois, was expected to be relatively short, and everyone seemed to believe that they could endure a few days of discomfort for the sake of getting home. The desire to return home overrode any lingering doubts about safety, as the soldiers, weary and hopeful, simply wanted the journey to begin. The Sultana, now grotesquely overloaded, finally cast off from the bustling Memphis docks. It was April 24, 1865. A sense of relief washed over the thousands of soldiers crammed on board, despite the suffocating conditions. They had endured so much, and now home felt within reach. The steamboat, a floating city of blue, began its slow, labored journey north on the Mississippi River. The initial excitement, however, was soon mixed with a growing unease. The sheer weight of the human cargo made the vessel sit unusually low in the water, and every movement of the engine sent tremors through the decks. As the Sultana churned upstream, the signs of trouble began to surface. Engineers in the boiler room reported minor leaks. These weren't new issues. The boilers had been patched up hastily in Vicksburg just days before. The repairs had been rushed, done under pressure to get the boat back in service quickly, and likely not to the highest standard. Now the increased strain from carrying such an immense load began to expose those weak points. Steam hissed from small cracks, and the crew worked constantly, trying to shore up the failing sections. It was a stressful, dangerous dance, trying to keep the powerful engines running while ignoring the obvious distress signals from the machinery. Captain Speed, despite the reports from his engineers, continued to push the boat. He was under a tight schedule, and the financial incentive for each soldier he delivered safely was too strong to ignore. He urged his crew to maintain speed, to make up for lost time. The river itself was also a challenge. The Mississippi was swollen and fast-flowing from spring rains, creating strong currents that put even more stress on the Sultana's already overburdened engines and hull. Every turn, every push against the current was a test of the vessel's limits. On board, a growing sense of unease settled among some of the soldiers and crew. The constant vibrations from the straining engines were more intense than usual. Strange groans and metallic clangs echoed from the engine room, sounds that were not part of the normal rhythm of a steamboat. Some of the more experienced rivermen among the crew exchanged worried glances. They knew the Mississippi, and they knew the dangers of pushing a boat too hard. Yet, no one spoke up forcefully enough to challenge the captain's orders. The chain of command was clear, and the desire to complete the journey overshadowed common sense. The soldiers, many still weak from their time in Confederate prisons, tried to find what comfort they could. They lay wherever they could on the hard decks, bundled together for warmth against the cool night air. Dreams of home, of family and of peace filled their minds, overshadowing the discomfort and the subtle, worrying creaks of the boat beneath them. They had survived war, disease, and starvation. A crowded steamboat seemed a minor inconvenience. Little did they know, the journey itself was becoming the greatest threat they had ever faced. The air was thick with the faint smell of steam and the underlying scent of coal smoke, a smell that would soon become synonymous with tragedy. The river flowed on, dark and indifferent, carrying its heavy burden further into the night. Every mile gained was a mile closer to a destination, but also a mile closer to disaster, a fact only known by the straining metal and the increasingly desperate efforts of the engineering crew. The belief that the journey would be short and uneventful was a comfort, but a false one. The stage was set for a catastrophe, building silently beneath the surface of the river and the hopes of thousands of men. The Sultana finally pulled away from the Memphis docks, a dark, hulking shape against the night sky. On board, a strange mix of relief and excitement washed over the thousands of soldiers. They were finally moving, heading north, heading home. Despite the crushing crowds, the cramped spaces where men sat shoulder to shoulder, or lay tangled together on every available surface, there was a sense of progress. The engines groaned, a deep, continuous rumble that vibrated through the deck plates and up into their weary bones. The paddle wheels churned the Mississippi into a frothy wake, pushing the overloaded vessel against the strong current. As the boat made its way upriver, the early mechanical issues that had been brewing began to show themselves more clearly. Below deck, in the hot, noisy engine room, the engineers were fighting a losing battle. The patched-up boilers, already stressed, were now under immense pressure. Small leaks that had been manageable earlier started to widen. Hissing sounds became more frequent, and the smell of steam grew stronger, mixing with the coal smoke and the sweat of the men working with frantic energy. Crew members ran back and forth, tightening bolts, trying to plug new leaks that appeared almost as fast as they could fix the old ones. It was a race against time and against the limits of the machinery itself. Captain Speed, from the pilot house, remained focused on speed. He knew the river, and he knew the schedule he had to keep. Reports from the engine room were relayed to him, grim updates about the failing boilers. But his orders remained the same. Keep pushing. The thought of the bounty for each soldier delivered, the pressure to get these men home quickly, overrode any serious consideration of slowing down or stopping for proper repairs. He believed they could make it. that the patchwork fixes would hold for just a little longer. However, a growing unease spread beyond the engine room. The constant, heavy vibrations were more pronounced than any normal steamboat journey. Soldiers trying to sleep on the decks felt the shuddering deep in their chests. From time to time, a sharp metallic clang would cut through the engine's drone, making men stir and look around nervously. Even those who had never been on a steamboat before could tell something wasn't quite right. The veteran rivermen among the crew, who usually kept to themselves, now exchanged worried glances and hushed words. They understood the language of a straining vessel, and the Sultana was screaming. The river itself was not helping. The Mississippi was exceptionally high and fast-flowing that spring, swollen by heavy rains. This meant the Sultana had to fight harder against the current, demanding even more from its already overworked engines and failing boilers. Every bend in the river, every surge of the current, added to the stress on the hull and machinery. The dark waters moved swiftly past the boat, a powerful, indifferent force. Despite the growing tension, many soldiers tried to ignore it. They had endured so much already. They had survived battlefields, prison camps, and the long, slow march of war. A noisy, vibrating boat seemed like a small price to pay for the promise of home. They talked of wives, children, farms, and the simple joys of civilian life. These conversations, hushed and hopeful, created a fragile bubble of optimism on the crowded decks, a stark contrast to the desperate struggle happening below. The air on deck was cool, but the air in the engine room was stifling, thick with heat and the smell of hot metal and escaping steam. The engineers, their faces grim and streaked with grease, knew they were on borrowed time. They watched the pressure gauges climb, then fall, then climb again, a dangerous dance that defied their best efforts. The Sultana was a ticking clock, and the engineers were the only ones who truly heard its desperate beat. The journey continued, mile after straining mile, carrying its precious, unsuspecting cargo further into the dark, unforgiving night. The Sultana pushed onward, a dark silhouette against the even darker Mississippi sky. Most of the soldiers, exhausted from the war and the cramped conditions, were fast asleep. They sprawled wherever they could find a spot, on deck, in the cabins, even wedged between cargo. Their dreams were likely filled with images of home, of loved ones waiting, of the simple, peaceful lives they had fought so hard to reclaim. The rhythmic churn of the paddle wheels and the deep thrum of the engines became a lullaby for many, masking the underlying strain of the vessel. The river was quiet, its dark surface reflecting nothing but the faint twinkle of distant stars, broken only by the occasional ripple from the steamboat's passage. Around 2 in the morning, the relative calm shattered. A sound like thunder ripped through the night, followed by a violent shudder that ran through the entire boat. One of the Sultana's 4 boilers had exploded. The force was immense, tearing through the deck and sending debris, steam, and human bodies flying into the air. Screams of terror and pain immediately erupted, piercing the quiet night. The initial explosion was a deafening roar, a sudden, brutal awakening for everyone on board. Chaos erupted instantly. The boiler burst with unimaginable power, not just a leak, but a full rupture. Superheated steam, hotter than any flame, instantly scalded anyone nearby. Men who had been sleeping peacefully were suddenly engulfed in a cloud of invisible, searing death. The deck above the boiler room collapsed, trapping many below, and creating gaping holes through which the inferno would soon rise. Those who weren't immediately killed or horribly burned were thrown from their bunks or off the crowded decks. The tragedy didn't stop with the first blast. The initial explosion triggered a horrifying chain reaction. The immense pressure and heat from the first ruptured boiler compromised the others. Within moments, a second boiler, then a third, also exploded. Each blast was a new wave of destruction, ripping through the ship's structure. The Sultana, built largely of wood and fueled by coal and oil, became a tinderbox. Flames erupted almost simultaneously with the explosions, feeding on everything flammable: wood, oil, and the bedding and clothes of the soldiers. The ship was now an inferno, a towering bonfire on the dark river. The flames shot high into the night sky, casting an eerie, flickering light across the water and illuminating the horror unfolding on board. The screams intensified as the fire spread with terrifying speed. The deck, where thousands of men had been sleeping just moments before, was now a raging furnace. Smoke billowed thick and acrid, making it impossible to see or breathe. The Sultana was no longer a vessel of hope, but a floating tomb, its structure rapidly disintegrating under the combined assault of explosions and fire. The once proud steamboat was now a burning wreck, drifting helplessly, its fate sealed. The Sultana, now a blazing monument to disaster, drifted slowly on the dark, wide Mississippi. The roaring fire consumed the wooden structure with terrifying speed, painting the night sky a ghastly orange. Intense heat radiated from the burning wreckage, making it impossible to stay on what remained of the decks. For those who hadn't been killed by the explosions or the initial steam, a new horrifying choice emerged: burn alive on the disintegrating vessel or plunge into the cold, swirling depths of the river below. Neither option offered much hope, but one promised a quicker end. Thousands of men, desperate to escape the inferno, began to jump or were simply thrown from the ship by the collapsing structure. The air filled with the sounds of splashing screams and the crackle of flames. Plunging into the icy, churning water of the Mississippi was a shock to the system. The river, still swollen from recent rains and snowmelt, was bitterly cold, sapping strength from even the strongest swimmers. The current was powerful, pulling at bodies and debris alike, making it incredibly difficult to stay afloat or swim to safety. Many of the soldiers, weakened by their time in prison camps and already exhausted, quickly succumbed to the elements. The water became a chaotic, terrifying scene. Men thrashed, cried out, and desperately clawed at anything that floated. Pieces of the Sultana's wreckage, planks, railings, even parts of the paddle wheels, became makeshift life rafts, though often too small or unstable to support the weight of multiple men. Logs and other debris, carried by the river's current, also offered a fleeting chance of survival, but often proved just as dangerous, colliding with people or dragging them under. The sheer number of people in the water was overwhelming. There was no organized rescue effort possible in the immediate aftermath. It was every man for himself against the river's brutal embrace. The cries for help echoed across the water. Some were loud and frantic, others weak and fading. As time stretched on, the desperate pleas slowly began to diminish, swallowed by the vastness of the river and the relentless roar of the fire. Many men, unable to swim or too injured, simply slipped beneath the surface, their last breath a silent bubble in the dark water. Others, clinging to debris, found their hands growing numb, their grip weakening, until they too were swept away by the current. The cold was a constant, insidious enemy, stealing warmth and strength, leading to hypothermia that rendered even strong swimmers helpless. The river itself seemed to conspire against them. The powerful currents not only pulled them away from the burning ship, but also scattered them across a wide expanse, making any hope of concentrated rescue nearly impossible. Debris from the explosion, sharp and heavy, became underwater hazards, striking men and dragging them down. The darkness of the night added another layer of terror, making it impossible to see what lay ahead or how far safety might be. Each moment in the water was a battle against exhaustion, cold, and the crushing despair of knowing that help was unlikely to arrive quickly enough for everyone. The once calm river had transformed into a vast, watery graveyard, filled with the dying and the dead, a chilling testament to the night's unfolding horror. The Sultana continued to burn, a macabre beacon guiding more victims into the water, and the struggle for survival became a desperate, lonely fight against impossible odds. The burning Sultana, a horrific pyre on the dark Mississippi, was not entirely unseen. Far downriver and even from the banks, the colossal blaze was a terrifying sight. The glow from the inferno painted the night sky a sickly orange, a beacon of unimaginable tragedy. People in small towns along the river, awakened by the distant explosions or the strange light, began to realize something terrible had happened. Other steamboats, making their own way up or down the river, also spotted the unnatural brilliance. For many it was a moment of confused alarm, quickly turning to horror as the scale of the disaster became clear. The first to respond were often other boats already on the river. One such vessel, the steamboat Bostona, was heading downstream not far from the site of the explosion. Its crew and passengers witnessed the terrible spectacle unfolding upstream. They immediately altered course, turning their boat around and steaming towards the burning wreck. The Bostona was not alone. Other boats, like the Powell, also rushed to the scene. Their approach, however, was fraught with danger. The river was choked with debris, and the screams of hundreds, possibly thousands, of men echoed across the water. The sight that greeted these early rescuers was overwhelming. The Mississippi, usually a symbol of commerce and travel, had become a vast, churning mass of human despair. The crew of the Bostona, along with those from other arriving boats, quickly began the arduous task of pulling survivors from the water. It was a chaotic and heartbreaking effort. There were so many men, scattered over such a wide area, many barely clinging to life. The rescuers used ropes, poles, and anything else they could find to reach out to the struggling soldiers. They pulled men aboard, shivering, burned, and often too weak to help themselves. The decks of the rescue boats quickly filled with exhausted survivors, some crying, some in shock, others simply staring blankly ahead. But for every man pulled alive from the frigid water, there were many more who were already gone. Rescuers often found themselves pulling out bodies, stiff and cold, or encountering men who died in their arms moments after being brought aboard. The sheer number of victims made any organized rescue incredibly challenging. It wasn't a matter of finding a few people, it was a matter of finding hundreds, maybe thousands, in the dark, cold river. The limited resources of a few steamboats were no match for the scale of the catastrophe. Every rescued life felt like a small miracle amidst the vastness of the loss. The emotional toll on those involved in the rescue was immense. The sights, sounds, and smells of the disaster were almost unbearable. They saw young men who had just survived the horrors of war, now dying a terrible death so close to home. They heard the desperate pleas for help, and the silence that followed when those pleas stopped. The deckhands and crew, many of whom had seen their share of hardship on the river, were visibly shaken. They worked tirelessly, driven by a grim determination to save as many as they could, even as the realization dawned on them that the death toll would be catastrophic, far beyond anything they had ever witnessed. As dawn approached, the true horror became even clearer. The pale light revealed the river covered not just with debris but with bodies. The rescue boats continued their grim work, now in the stark light of day, pulling out more dead than living. The river, which had swallowed so many in the darkness, now reluctantly gave up its victims. The rescuers knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not just an accident. It was one of the worst disasters in American history, a tragic end for so many who had hoped to finally be home. The first light of day brought a chilling clarity to the scene, highlighting the full scope of the tragedy. The vast Mississippi, once a path to freedom, was now a watery grave. Bodies, bloated and pale, floated downstream, mixing with the charred wreckage of the Sultana. The river, which had swallowed so many in the darkness, now reluctantly gave up its victims. Debris, splintered wood, personal belongings, parts of the steamboat structure, was scattered for miles. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke, wet ash, and death. As the sun climbed higher, military and civilian authorities began to arrive, their faces grim. The task ahead was immense, identifying the dead, tending to the injured, and beginning the long, painful process of understanding what had happened. Temporary morgues were set up on the riverbanks, quickly overflowing. Doctors and nurses, many still reeling from the war, worked tirelessly, but the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed their resources. Survivors, many severely burned or suffering from hypothermia, recounted horrific tales of the explosion, the fire and the struggle in the icy water. Each story added another layer to the unfolding nightmare. Almost immediately, official inquiries were launched to determine the cause of the explosion. The public demanded answers. Investigations focused on several critical areas: the condition of the Sultana's boilers, the extreme overcrowding, and potential negligence on the part of the captain or the military officials responsible for transport. Witnesses were interviewed, engineers provided their assessments, and what remained of the steamboat was meticulously examined. However, assigning definitive blame proved difficult. The chaos of the event, combined with the loss of key witnesses and the destruction of evidence, made a clear-cut conclusion elusive. Captain Frederick Speed, who had been in charge of the troop transport at Vicksburg, faced court-martial charges for overcrowding the vessel. However, The charges were eventually dropped due to a lack of sufficient evidence and the complexities of the military chain of command during wartime. Captain Cass Mason of the Sultana, though initially blamed by many, died in the explosion, taking his version of events with him. The engineers who might have shed light on the boiler's condition also perished. The investigation highlighted a system under immense pressure, where the urgent need to send soldiers home often overrode safety concerns. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the disaster was the challenge of accurately determining the number of casualties. The Sultana was massively overcrowded, with official manifests listing only a fraction of the actual passengers. Soldiers had boarded without proper documentation, and many were simply desperate to get home. This lack of precise records meant that the exact death toll would forever remain an estimate. Official reports eventually settled on around 1,800 fatalities, but many historians and survivors believed the true number was closer to 200, or even higher, possibly exceeding 200. This made the Sultana disaster the worst maritime disaster in United States history, a grim record that still stands today. The sheer scale of the loss, coupled with the circumstances of the returning soldiers, added a profound layer of tragedy. These men had survived the horrors of the Civil War, endured brutal prisoner-of-war camps, and were finally on their way home to their families. To die so close to freedom, not by enemy fire but by a preventable accident, was a cruel twist of fate. The disaster served as a stark reminder of the hidden costs of war, even after the fighting had officially ended and the dangers inherent in a system pushed to its absolute limits. The Sultana disaster, despite its horrifying scale and immense loss of life, gradually faded from public memory. It became what many historians call the forgotten tragedy. How could such a catastrophic event, claiming more lives than the Titanic, be largely overlooked in the annals of American history? The answer lies in the timing. The explosion occurred just days after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, an event that plunged the entire nation into a deep and profound mourning. The end of the Civil War, with its complex political and social aftermath, also dominated headlines and public attention. People were exhausted by war and loss. Another tragedy, however immense, struggled to find its place in the national consciousness. There was no widespread media coverage in the way we understand it today, no instant communication to spread the word far and wide. Local newspapers reported it, of course, but the story was quickly overshadowed by the larger narrative of a nation trying to heal. For those who survived, the memory never faded. Personal accounts from the few who made it through paint a vivid picture of lifelong trauma. Men who had faced battlefields bravely found themselves haunted by the screams of their comrades, the inferno, and the icy grip of the Mississippi. They carried the scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. Many survivors rarely spoke of it, finding it too painful to revisit. Yet, their stories, passed down through families, formed a quiet testament to the horror. Descendants and dedicated historians have since taken up the mantle, working tirelessly to ensure the Sultana's story is not completely lost. They gather old letters, newspaper clippings, and personal anecdotes, piecing together the fragmented narrative. Today, memorials and historical markers stand in various locations along the Mississippi River, particularly in Arkansas and Tennessee, serving as solemn reminders of the disaster. These modest tributes ensure that the names of some of the lost are remembered, and that the sheer scale of the tragedy is acknowledged. They are places where one can reflect on the lives cut short, the families devastated, and the forgotten heroes who perished so close to home. These markers are not grand monuments, but quiet, dignified testaments to a profound loss. The Sultana disaster, in its grim way, did leave a lasting impact on steamboat safety regulations. While not an immediate overhaul, the tragedy contributed to a growing awareness of the need for stricter inspections, better maintenance protocols, and more rigorous enforcement of passenger limits. It highlighted the dangers of prioritizing profit and expediency over the lives of human beings. Over time, these lessons helped shape the maritime safety standards that are commonplace today. The disaster reminded everyone that even after the cannons fall silent, the costs of war can continue to mount, sometimes in unexpected and tragic ways. The story of the Sultana is ultimately a reflection on the human desire to return home, the pressures of a nation in transition, and the devastating consequences when safety is compromised. It's a poignant reminder of the sacrifices made, not just on the battlefield, but also in the desperate journey back to peace. The soldiers on the Sultana had endured so much, fought for their country, and dreamed of reuniting with their loved ones. Their final journey, cut short by a preventable disaster, is a powerful and tragic chapter in American history, one that deserves to be remembered and understood. It speaks to the enduring importance of valuing every life and ensuring that no hero, especially one returning home, is ever forgotten. Their spirits, perhaps, still drift on the currents of the Mississippi, a silent testament to a journey that ended too soon.